What's up, guys? I hope you're doing well. James here from jamesdforsythe.com, and I wanted to take a few moments to go over and talk about kind of the power structure for the Federal Reserve's regional reserve banks, right? And more specifically, going back in history and looking at a few letters, or at least some excerpts from letters from the likes of Carter Glass during this kind of creation of the Federal Reserve itself. And also kind of looking at Paul Warburg's perspective and kind of an excerpt from one of his articles from 1909, and kind of going back to how this whole concept of what exactly should the regional reserve banks be able to do, how should power be structured, how should there be a governing board, that sort of thing, and kind of looking into that question. So kind of going back onto Carter Glass's thoughts, right? And excuse me looking down for notes. Obviously, I'm using excerpts and stuff, so just to be helpful. But anyways, so basically with Carter Glass, right, he was more of the mind that basically, I'm just going to quote him directly to start with at least, he must have started as other financial reformers before him had done, with the idea of a large number of independent and entirely disconnected central banks, basically having each regional reserve bank being their own central bank for the region and stuff. A concept we've talked about before, and kind of mostly the disadvantages of that, specifically with like they basically compete. They'd compete against each other, which kind of completely defeats the purpose of centralizing reserves, because that was the whole point, was to have a centralized reserve in which basically if, say, Boston was in trouble, reserves could flow over there where they were needed, instead of basically having banks hoard reserves in terms of basically having banks hoard the reserves at the expense of the system as a whole, right? Kind of this whole like stand together and survive at that point during financial panics and stuff. So in as much as he had not provided for a limitation of dividends payable to stockholders, these banks, had they been called into existence, would have entered into keen competition with one another. That last sentence being a statement from Warburg, kind of commenting on Glass's thoughts in general, kind of what I was more or less just saying. And you can see this reflected later. Let's see, this is a quote from Mr. Glass in a letter in which he wrote to Woodrow Wilson in late 1912. It's December 29th, 1912. And so basically where he's kind of calling for some body of central supervisory control, I'd assume what became the Board of Governors. And then if such a body can be constituted and divested of the practical attributes of a central bank, right? So basically having the Board of Governors being purely just supervisory at this time. That was kind of the whole, at least what seemed to be his thought process. However, kind of this whole concept of these regional banks and how that power is going to be structured, and this having them be sectionalized in terms of being an independent central bank for each region isn't new, right? At least, obviously not now, but like even at this time, it wasn't Carter Glass's original thought. He didn't come up with it, right? It's actually being cited back to before Glass got involved in banking reform, only by a couple years though. And so specifically with someone by the name of Mr. Victor Morawetz, and this was as early as 1909, and then he eventually kind of changed his mind about it in January of 1911, which we'll get more into in a few minutes, right? So basically Morawetz introduced this regional plan, and then Warburg, kind of knowing him, says his attitude towards it was sympathetic, provided the decentralization did not go too far, and provided also that it contained some means of joining the regional banks together, right? Again, this is one thing that Warburg has said rather in depth in various articles that he's written, in letters, commentary, advice, everything. Basically, that they can't be independent subject banks, mostly because of that competition aspect we brought up. But there has to be some form of connection beyond just kind of a superficial, I guess, business relationship. Beyond that, there has to be a formal kind of, I guess, legal in a way, connection between them, right? And for that, he quotes himself from an article he published in 1909, a United Reserve Bank of the United States, something we went more in depth with in a previous video, going over kind of the actual plan that he provided for his United Reserve Bank. And this was before even the Aldrich Bill and all of that stuff was happening. So going over to that, and again, this is more related to, in this article that he wrote, it's actually directly related to, in the excerpt that we're using, to Morawetz's thoughts, right? He actually kind of directly calls them out in this article, bringing up the fact that these sectional reserve banks must be endowed with all the powers and charged with all the duties given under our plan to the United Reserve Bank branches. Otherwise, they will be nothing more than safe deposit vaults, which will have to hold for each bank the exact amount of cash received from it for safekeeping, right? And by kind of all the powers is these sectional reserve banks, from Warburg's perspective, couldn't just be, let me articulate this better. So basically, if the power resolves in the Board of Governors, what's now the Board of Governors, basically, if they were more than just a supervisory role for the regional reserve banks, then basically each regional reserve bank would just be like a safe deposit box, for lack of a better term. At least that's what it seems from here. So basically, by all the powers that he uses, these regional reserve banks have to some degree, be independent, obviously. And we see this reflected in the fact that, at least to begin with, they were able to set their own discount rates and that sort of thing. They were functioning on their own. This changed later, specifically with the discount rates, to be more explicit with the example, with the discount rates themselves, at first the regional reserve banks set it their own, and then basically what became the Board of Governors kind of, what's the word for it? They allowed them to set that. Basically, they were kind of a check on them. So the reserve banks themselves would tell the Board of Governors, hey, this is what we want, this is what we're doing, and then basically the Board of Governors could veto it or not. And specifically because the thought was that for each region, the optimal discount rate would be different, or could be different, depending on basically the economies and stuff in each region, kind of keeping in mind why there's regions to begin with, and how the regions were set was based on basically the economies and kind of industries that were prevalent at the time. So like if you look at a map of the regions, like the ones up in the Northeast are, in terms of the actual industries there, are completely different than, say, the Southwest or whatever, right? There's a reason they were basically modeled off of trade boundaries at the time. And that's why it was also helpful to have them be independent in their setting of a discount rate. This changed later when basically the discount rate in general was purely just for the Board of Governors, but that's kind of future stuff. But regardless, to continue on, so he says they cannot go a single step further without incurring the gravest danger unless they have some central bank to fall back upon, or unless they themselves are central banks, that is to say, disconnected central bank branches. So it's kind of looking at this more from the perspective of it being an actual system, in terms of that's why it's called the Federal Reserve System, to where you have kind of the Board of Governors, and like the Board of Governors and the FOMC, which didn't exist at this time, because keeping in mind this is like 1909 and 1912-ish is the area we're looking at. And there goes the train of thought. But So disconnected central bank branches, right? And so basically keeping in mind that it's a system as a whole, and not individual central banks, right? So kind of still playing on that whole idea of each region does not have its own central bank, but it has some of the powers, and that's kind of shared, for lack of a better term, with the Board of Governors, right? And that kind of supervisory board who had other powers as well. And this kind of goes back on to, I forget who technically published it. It was one of the original Board of Governors, I believe, shortly after the Fed was incorporated or whatever. Basically, he said like there's 129 powers for the actual system itself, and that's a rabbit hole I'm not going to go down to try to stay kind of in line at least. So to continue on, so these sectional reserve banks must in the end act as a unit, so they have to be connected in some form. And then otherwise, we shall have a recurrence of our experiences of the end of 1907, the Panic of 1907, when one reserve center closed itself against the others, right? The hoarding of reserves that we were talking about earlier. Again, there has to be some formal connection between each region, and they can act so that they can act as a whole and basically work with each other, but not exclusively, right? So basically allowing decentralization to the point to where the different regions can work optimally for themselves, but also acting as a unit. So when one particular region or a couple regions or whatever are doing very poorly, maybe due to some financial panic or whatever, if some panic is centralized to New York or to Chicago for whatever financial reasons, basically the rest of the country can help save them, and you don't have to worry about the likes of J.P. Morgan or someone to come in and save it, right? So that being said, the knowledge that all will stand together gives a feeling of confidence and safety. It is the same with our financial resources. They must be held united under one direction, to be thrown where they are needed, and to be withdrawn from places where they are superfluous, right? And eventually, Morawetz actually kind of converts to Warburg's thinking, and this is what he did he published a new paper in January of 1911, to where basically he kind of converted over to that, saying he recommended a system of divisional banks linked together by a central association, kind of more or less of what we have now and what Warburg was proposing and his kind of original thoughts for a United Reserve Bank. Keeping in mind that the United Reserve Bank and its plan was basically just Warburg's personal plan that was kind of he used as a basis for his advice for the Aldrich plan when he was dealing with Senator Aldrich, and then also when he really trying to transfer to help the Democrats in terms of kind of advising them in the creation of the Federal Reserve Bill and Federal Reserve Act, technically, I guess, when the Democrats took control when Woodrow Wilson was elected, right? So I guess kind of the biggest takeaway for this in general is really the thought for the power for the regional reserve banks was really for this kind of decentralization in terms of being able to act as independent entities to optimally help their specific region for their own interests, but also being connected to prevent the hoarding of reserves in the collapse of the system as a whole, right? And so basically they're able to help one of, I guess it's a lot like a kind of a military alliance in that respect. Drawing, I guess, I don't know how well of an analogy that is, but yeah, I guess, to where there's basically like, there's individual countries that are sovereign entities in and of themselves, but it's also like, if one of them gets attacked, they kind of all help. And now again, you just kind of see that with respect to, you can see the downfalls of that throughout history. Like, for example, with World War I and II, believe it was more applicable for 2 in terms of, basically all these alliances pulling in a lot more countries than probably otherwise would have. But not trying to go too far down that topic in and of itself. But also keeping in mind how that's probably not going to 100% translate into the monetary system of one country, right? Because the country is the sovereign entity, and so you can't really say each individual region would be its own sovereign entity. You could argue from the point of the states, but then that also kind of gets into the individual states themselves, states' rights, and that sort of thing, which is a completely different topic from the United States. But anyways, I think I'm going to leave this one here before I just kind of ramble on about other things that aren't applicable to this. But anyways, so I'm going to leave this one here. I hope you guys have a good night, and I'll see you on the next one.